Greetings, seekers and freakers. Today I want to talk a little bit about the concept of ego in Zen. I want to unpack this term a little bit, get at what it means within a Buddhist context, the context of anatta or no self, and perhaps unpack this saying we used to have at the monastery, which is kill the ego. So what is the ego within the Zen Buddhist context? Well, maybe let's talk about what ego means in the Western philosophical context. So it's been a long time since I've read Freud, but my understanding of ego within the Freudian context, which is kind of the foundation for Western psychology, you could say, you could argue, and you might, perhaps you have. With Freud, you have the id, which is the subconscious, it's the inner cave person, instinctual drives and desires, right? That's down at the bottom of us. It's there, it's poking its lousy, wonderful, ravenous head up and saying, give me intercourse, give me fat, sugar, pleasure, give me everything. This is like the subconscious, all right, I think. Like I said, it's been a long time since I've read Freud. That's the id, right? The id is like Mr. Hyde in the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde story, okay? So then we have the external world, right? Which has its own rules, which has its own guidelines, which has its own boundaries, right? And which does not exist simply to satisfy the bottomless pit of desire that is the id. So, within the psyche, there is something called the ego. And within the Freudian context, it is my understanding, perhaps flawed, but it is my understanding that the ego negotiates. So the ego has to deal with the reality principle, and the reality principle is, look, I want to have intercourse with 100,000 people, but the fact remains there are not that many condoms in my drawer to have intercourse with 100,000 people, nor are there 100,000 people at the ready to have intercourse with me. And so the ego says, we need to figure this out. And so it negotiates with the outside world. It deals with the reality principle and tries to satisfy the id. So the ego stands on the cusp of the inside and the outside worlds and is constantly trying to figure out how to satisfy the id while also, not going to prison or alienating the outside world too much. Now, you can have a healthy ego in the Western context, and this is important. You can have a healthy sense of self. What does it mean to have a healthy sense of self or a healthy ego? This has been a kind of a problem, a challenge that I've worked on my entire life. I mean, when I was a very young man, I had very low self-esteem. That's how I defined the problem. I didn't have any confidence. And having been raised in the West, in a Midwestern Catholic household, I took for granted that I was the same person from one moment to the next. I took for granted that I was me, and that I had a self or an ego, a thing inside this body that was looking out at the world. And I was not comfortable with that thing or self or ego that was inside the body looking out at the world. I didn't like that guy in there. I thought he didn't measure up. He wasn't confident enough. He didn't believe in himself. He wasn't talented enough, brilliant enough, or funny enough, right? So I had self-esteem issues. I had an unhealthy ego, or an unhealthy or underdeveloped sense of self. And this plagued me for many, many years, and it followed me through my quixotic attempts to become a great basketball player or athlete in high school, followed me through all my studies of Western philosophy in college, from the pre-Socratics through the postmodernists. It was there with me as I developed into an artist and a writer and tried to heave my artistic ambitions onto the world, and it followed me into Hollywood, where I was a screenwriter trying to make movies, and then it followed me right up to the doorstep of the monastery, where I met a Zen Buddhist master who basically, through his lectures and our private interactions or koan meetings, told me essentially that my entire notion of the self, or the ego, or what he called the I am, is, he would laugh. He would lean back and laugh. And he would say, "You are making a fundamental error. Too much ego." One thing I've come to realize over the years is that my journey is not unusual. Everybody you see on the bus, on a street corner, everybody in your family, the person lying next to you in bed at night, all of us have ego. And most of us really believe in the presence of ourselves. We believe that we are in here, but behind our eyeballs and inside of our body. We take that for granted. My teacher called this fixating the self. And again, he would throw back his head and laugh and say, "This is an error. This is an illusion. Okay, this is the cause of suffering." And suffering in Buddhism, in Zen, is the problem that we're trying to solve. We're not trying to figure out what happens after we die, and we're not trying to answer the question of whether or not there is or is not a God, etc. We're trying to solve the problem of suffering. And the problem of suffering comes from this attachment to ourselves. Okay? Fixated attachment to the self. So there are a lot of different expressions of this attachment. This is maybe something we should explore a little bit. Like, for example, I was a nervous and self-conscious kid without a ton of confidence within certain contexts. I was a bully and an asshole in other contexts, but we'll leave that aside and we'll concentrate on the nerdy, insecure aspects, right? Now, you would think that somebody who is insecure and lacking in self-esteem would be somebody who would have a low ego. But in fact, sometimes wallflowers and nerds are the most egoic people. They are believing the most completely and are identifying the most completely with themselves, right? They can't escape the problem of the self. It's heavy and it weighs them down inside. Always they're looking at themselves. They're self-conscious. They're aware of themselves. This, to me, is the definition of hell. Being trapped inside yourself. I mean, conversely, you can have someone who seems to be full of ego, like a great Zorba the Greek type character who is extroverted and loud. You know the type of person. And one might look at him or her and think, God, that person is full of ego. But in fact, maybe they are not. Maybe this is just their way of getting outside of themselves and connecting with their surroundings and forgetting themselves. Forgetting yourself is a key concept we're going to come back to. So the person who seems to be full of ego by our kind of superficial cultural, social standards may not be necessarily somebody who's full of ego. So this is important. It's not a moral judgment to say a person has a lot of ego within the Zen Buddhist tradition. It's simply someone who is weighed down by the problem of the self. Okay, so how do we begin to approach or solve this problem of the self? Now, let's look at my teacher's Tathagata Zen principle and how he might, how he taught me as one of his young monks to think about the problem of the self. During Zen sessions or retreats, my teacher would give teishos, which were public lectures, and I've got a collection of them here. I want to read you something. He said, as long as you are fixating yourself or attaching to yourself, as long as you are attaching to yourself, it doesn't matter how much you are able to satisfy your desires, you still will be stuck in your fixated self. The self which gives rise to the heart that truly wants to practice Zen Buddhism, or escape suffering, you could say, is the self that understands that there is no fixated self. There truly is no fixated I am self. And here's sort of his answer to the problem of self. The standpoint of somebody who is really practicing Zen, or within this context, he's saying putting the principles of Buddhism or the Dharma into practice, which is to say living a true life. The standpoint of somebody who's really practicing, who really understands that there is no such thing as the fixated self, then for that person, no matter what you meet in your life, no matter what you meet, whether it's a flower, a man, a woman, a dog, a mountain, a god, or the devil, you know that the kind of practice you must do is to give yourself to that objective circumstance. Okay? So the job of the self, or the job of attention or awareness, is to give oneself to connect to the objective circumstance, the external world. So you can see the difference between this philosophy and the philosophy of Freud. The Freud philosophy is, what can I get? What can I take? What can the ego grab? Okay? That was really my philosophy, unquestioned, for many, many years. How can I build up myself? But right here, there's something else going on, right? If you really understand that there's no such thing as a fixated self, then whether it's a flower, a man, a woman, a dog, a mountain, God, or the devil, the kind of practice you must do is give yourself to that objective circumstance. And Roshi says, what we call making relationship. Very different than this idea of taking, this idea of a solid me over here and a solid world over there, and life is the process of getting as much of that world as you can for yourself, as much love, as much affirmation, as much money, as much sex, whatever it is that you want from that world, right? This is very different. It says, actually, you're making relationship, okay? And Roshi says, what we call this connecting to the objective or the objective world is to not fixate yourself. That's it. So you connect to the quote-unquote objective world, all right? And that is the activity of not attaching to yourself or to your ego. So if you're feeling hyper self-conscious today, if you're feeling bad about yourself, if you're feeling insecure or scared, or you're carrying around this heavy clot of emotions that's like a gravitational pull taking your attention into this like black hole where no light can escape, maybe these teachings of no self can help lighten you up, right? Fundamentally, in Buddhism, in Zen, that self isn't real. You can laugh about it. It's not fundamentally real. What's real, if you will, is the Dharma activity, which is this big, joyous, vibrant family of interactions. And most simply, there's this outside condition, and then there's inside, okay? And they come together like a mother and father come together, moment after moment, and they give birth to a self. And then that self's job, that child of the moment's job, is to give back to outside what belongs to outside, or the appropriate awareness and attention there, and give back to inside what belongs to inside, the appropriate attention and awareness there. And when you're doing this giving of the self away, giving it back to mother and father, or giving it back to God, you could say, then you're doing the Dharma activity, and it's all good. If you want to do me some good, you can go to patreon.com/Shozan and become a patron. We do sits, Sunday meditation sits, which are really nice and fun and a good way to orient your practice at the start of a week. We do them on Sunday, intermittently throughout the month. I'm going to try and do more of them now. But anyways, you can come to patreon.com. There are also essays there. There are also blog posts there. And you can also support this channel by just going to PayPal, which is in the description below. And you can do a one-time donation there. You can hit the subscribe and hit the like button. I offer these videos for free, but more and more, this is becoming a key piece of my income. So I really appreciate your support. Take care.